SpongeBob SquarePants Battle for Bikini Bottom Rehydrated is a single-player game that has a very limited co-op mode, separate from the main game. This review is strictly for the co-op mode.
Live your dream of fighting a six-legged robot squid in Battle for Bikini Bottom's co-op horde mode. Is falling into goo any safer with two? The co-op mode has the same updated 3D platformer look of the main game, but with an unchanging, zoomed-out camera angle that makes the playable characters look small when it fills up with enemies. There's a constant marker on the top of the screen that identifies the island and wave number. Since the game doesn't give you any context, like how many waves or islands there are in total, this information is unnecessary and only serves as an occasional hiding place for enemies. The mode doesn't look bad, but it's less visually interesting than the main game due to the empty environments.
Battle for Bikini Bottom's co-op mode is an arcadey 3D beat-em-up. It's similar to a horde mode, in that you'll face progressively more difficult waves of enemies and area attacks. But this isn't a game where you see how far you can get before you die. The mode has an end goal, and death is only as punishing as the difficulty of retrying the wave you died on. Essentially, it's a boss fight that feels like an hour-long minigame. You'll visit a series of islands, occasionally pressing a button to do damage to Robot Squidward. To the mode's credit, there's a large variety of enemies that sometimes require different strategies to defeat, and the islands are varied in look and layout, occasionally presenting new challenges and obstacles, like requiring you to jump between platforms, avoid blasts of fire, or carefully walk to the edge of a large spoon. But once you've seen 3 or 4 different islands, you've seen them all. The mode doesn't vary up the gameplay with platforming challenges or collectibles. All you'll do is jump from island to island, dodge attacks, and kill everything in sight with your character's basic moveset. The most attractive new feature in the mode is the ability to play as characters that aren't playable in the single player: Squidward, Mr. Krabs, Roboplankton, and even Gary the Snail. But almost all of the characters feel the same to play, with the exceptions of Squidward and Roboplankton, whose primary attacks are ranged instead of melee, but feel awkward to control. You won't be seeing much of whatever character you choose, as the camera is zoomed out, and eventually the screen is so full of enemies, you'll have a hard time keeping track of where you are. The camera angle becomes an issue when you need to move south, but can't actually see where you're jumping, and the limited platforming is made more difficult by the inability to judge depth. Like in the main game, it's instant death if you fall into goo. It's surprisingly rare to be killed by enemy attacks alone, because almost every attack launches your character across the screen, often into goo. Near the end of the game, there are so many enemies and area attacks on screen that it becomes impossible to avoid damage, even if you're constantly on the move.
There's no reason this mode has to be co-op only, but the game will not let you play without a second player. When one player dies, they are revived after around 6 seconds with no penalty. If both players die at the same time, the current wave is restarted. Because of this, the game is easy until the last few islands. There's no revive mechanic, but with such a small penalty for death, there's also no need for one. At the end of each encounter with Robo Squidward, a screen comes up that shows each player's stats up to that point: your kills, deaths, and how many shiny objects you've collected. These don't really mean anything, unless you want some of the most unimpressive bragging rights you can think of. We wish that this menu would allow you to switch out characters so you could experiment with them without having to play through the mode again, as nothing changes between playthroughs.
There are no cutscenes or any sort of fanfare, and there's no obvious attempt to connect the events of the fight to the main game. We found ourselves wishing there was some context for the fight to give us some reward for finishing it. It simply ends with a menu giving you the option to play through it again, or go back to the main menu. There were no crashes or serious bugs in our playtime, but a few oddities. I don't think there are any frames of invulnerability after getting hit or respawning. Sometimes you respawn directly over goo and fall immediately to your death. Sometimes you respawn directly in the way of an attack and are launched into goo before you have a chance to react. And you might see a group of enemies walk right into goo, destroying themselves.
From what we heard, this mode is based on a boss fight that was planned for the original game, but never added. It's neat that they included it in some way in the remake, but it would be better if they somehow linked it to the main game with a proper cutscene or some additional dialogue to give it any sort of context. If you've ever played the main game and thought it would be fun to play with another person, this is probably not what you have in mind. The single-player game is a collectathon platformer that uses combat to add conflict and pad out the experience. Basing an entire mode off the most mediocre element of the game is bound to result in a mediocre experience. We had some fun playing through it once, but it's too long for how repetitive it is, and the lack of variety means we likely wouldn't replay it. If you already have the game and someone to play with, it doesn't hurt to try it. If you don't have the game and are thinking of getting it based on the 2-player possibilities, this is one we would not recommend.